to focus on themselves. It tells people that it is mainstream to value your own mental health, to value your own time. We get literally no mechanism from anyone on GovBench for a widespread alternative for access to mindfulness and talking about mental health. That's why they have to lose. Two questions within this debate. I'm going to be talking about what the likely alternative is, why that is specifically so damaging and was never good enough. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about how we change social attitudes in CO. So what is that likely alternative? Notice that within this debate, we largely have two main worlds clashing, the idea of therapy versus commercialization as we see it now. Look, right, there's an other alternative that comes out of our opening in terms of people turning towards things like smoking, like alcohol instead. It's probably likely there wasn't really a response to it, but crucially, Alicia goes further here, and this is where she has to win, because she tells you that even if things like therapy, which is definitely a positive and something that people should do, is the most likely alternative, what happens is exactly what OG characterizes, is that people with issues go to a therapist, is that people go to Alcoholics Anonymous when they have a problem a society tells them. That has two impacts. It means that one, you only avail of these things if you have a problem. Note that these are probably the people who would have accessed them anyway, but furthermore that it creates a massive stigma surrounding anyone else who wants to access those services in a way that they're never able to. Alicia explained that to you. But second of all, it means that this government bench had to stand over opposing healthcare for people on some kind of on a Buddhist principle. Like, look, they were told that a lot of forms of mindfulness are not related to religion, but that, look, we tell you that an awful lot of types of mindfulness do value their connection to different religions and focus on them. That was never a reason to deny people healthcare and caring about their mental health. But crucially, the impact of that is that more people don't seek help. Look, OG said that apps that tell you that you're actually anxious create a problem. No, we tell you that they validate all of the anxiety that you have been feeling in your daily life, day to day, and been told that you shouldn't because you should just work harder. It was never enough for them to stand over that. Look, Alicia explains to you really clearly the value of commercialization. We get a really glib response in the last speaker. Oh, well, I value my phone more because it's more expensive. Look, we tell you, you just necessarily attach more value to something if it is an activity that people are willing to pay for, that there are ads that come up in your phones for it, that you are well aware that influencers who you follow are being paid to give different seminars on mindfulness and how it works. In the world in which we value productivity, that attaching this value to it is how we get it into the mainstream, how we get people talking about their mental health. What we get out of OG and out of CG is this idea around business incentives in terms of commercialization, why they're specifically evil and not going to teach you it properly. Look, we tell you first of all that this is not how mindfulness works. You don't get told how to meditate once and then you're fine for the rest of your life. Alicia tells you that it is specifically learning a type of lifestyle. That means that obviously businesses are incentivized to teach you how to do it properly, because then you continue using their app because it is a great way for you to do your guided meditation. That's literally how it works. But even if that was true, at least people are talking about mental health on our side of the house. It still falls on our side. The impact of this is that we recognize that commercialization is the most important tool within the world we live to making things socially acceptable. Government was okay keeping people with mental health issues in the dark if it meant that they weren't going to be doing mindfulness incorrectly. On to the second question, who changes social attitudes? Look, Alicia explains exclusively in her speech why now is more important than ever. She talks to you about the pressure of everyday world. Under status quo, we see this changing to be more accepting of mental health issues, because you see ads come up on Instagram advertising calm, because you walk into a bookstore and there are mindful coloring books all around you. That means that one, it is more likely to be mainstream discussion around mental health, mindfulness, and all of the impacts of that. But two, you feel more legitimized in talking about it with your friends, with your family, and going to see a therapist because it is something that is mainstream. It's not a problem you have to suffer in isolation by yourself. Look, OG said that they would prefer people to just do yoga in the park. That never happens on their side because it looks too strange to be doing something that isn't talked about in the mainstream. I'll take a POI from OG.
Look, we gave you reasons why normalization of mental health happens regardless of commercializations. On your side, these complex problems are just now framed as something that can be fixed with an app or with mindfulness, such as depression.
Okay, no, they're not being framed as a once-all fix. It's being framed as a lifestyle that we want people to buy into. It's also something that there develops a discussion within society around, so you're more likely to get the types of solutions that you want. Also note, I've specifically explained to you why you actually don't give any mechanisms. You keep mental health as something that is stigmatized. However, more onto this idea of like spirit, you did have some stuff, I think, come out of CG about spiritual people are likely to push this anyway because religions want to. Look, spiritual people are going to be spiritual and do mindfulness on either side of this debate. We want mindfulness to be accessible to like people who are atheists, who do not believe in God, who do not access that side of themselves. We don't think they should be locked out just because they don't engage in religion in the way that CG wanted. But why is this specifically important? Look, because Alicia talks about how this is targeted on the most important groups within this debate. This is specifically why we take it over our opening, because we recognize the true impact of this. One, we talked about men, people who are told that they shouldn't have emotions. We talk about the massive suicide rate among young men because this is something they're never allowed to talk to. Alicia told you that, like, look, your rugby club is more likely to hold a seminar. That's something that's good. But even if that doesn't happen, maybe you download the app and see what's up with it. No one will know if you do. No one will know if you don't. It's not the same as going to a therapist. But secondly, she tells you about people like mothers and caregivers who are constantly told they can't put themselves first, that they need to look after their children, their older relatives. We tell you the value of a message of a society that values you putting yourself first, you taking your 20 minutes to color in. This idea about your self-worth being based on an app, I've already addressed that problem. That is an unfair characterization of the lifestyle of mindfulness. But look, the true comparative within this debate is we never get the type of discussion they wanted among the widespread population within the debate, because things are just easier to value when they're mainstream, when you don't have to go out of your way to access them. We tell you that we validate people putting themselves first, because look, it was never fair for the government to say that mindfulness has to be done correctly. If someone takes 20 minutes out of their day to do some coloring instead of stressing about their job, I don't care how well they've done that if they've acknowledged the religious roots. They're bettering their own mental health. Proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition rep and indeed thank all of the speakers in this debate for their fine speeches. Please leave this, wait, no, this is its own meeting, isn't it? Like, how? Okay, welcome back everyone. Please turn your cameras on if you can, just so like I'm not talking entirely to an empty room. Thank you so much. This is much better. Right, are we missing anyone? I think we have each team accounted for. Wonderful. So we had like a lovely discussion. I also really recommend talking to my panelists for feedback as well. We have one split decision in this call on like a comparative that we all mutually agreed was very close. So I also like think that like split is fair. It's just that the majority of us decided the other way around. So in the end, the call that we came to is unanimously, we give the first to the team in opening opposition. And then on a 2-1 split, the second to opening government over closing opposition in the third. And unfortunately, the fourth, again, unanimously to the team in closing government. I'll go over this debate chronologically and explain the like majority decision. So 2-1-4-3. Like if you want feedback on the other read, like feel free to like ask my wings afterwards if they want to say who was the split. Yeah, like starting with the opening half comparison and basically like doing kind of both teams in once and explaining how we think that trades off. So we think like in the end, the main point that we like get out of opening government is this idea that instead of actually helping you, these apps are more likely to stress you out. We think like they like mechanize this in several ways. They say that these constant reminders that are meant to hook you will like link this to failure and success. This is just gonna like replace this general success idea in society with now succeeding at this metric and succeeding at this app, and you're like gonna feel bad if you fail at it, if you don't keep your streak, and if you get like sad emojis. Then they also further say that this like is likely to make you aware of problems that otherwise you wouldn't even know you had, and now like make you feel anxious and make you feel like you need to do something about that when otherwise you wouldn't even have felt that. And they say that like all of this is just gonna like lead to actually like more stress and make you feel worse. And that in the alternative world, you would instead be accessing things like therapy or community-based things like help groups, but I think they also like mention things like YouTube videos and like other free resources that you could go for, which they say they like better because they actually provide help and they're more likely to analyze underlying problems to you. Kind of outside of this clash of where people best like deal with their mental health and best access help, opening government. In this debate, I'm really not good with team names. I'm sorry if I like mess it up again, but like opening government also bring a point on cultural appropriation and say that it is like illegitimate to take this, especially from colonized groups, and like that this is just a reduction and distortion of the history by just boiling it down to this mindfulness idea instead of like the full cultural thing that lies behind things like Buddhism and Hinduism. So we think that like dealing with probably this clash first, just because it's easier. Like I think that first of all, we have like as responses from opening opposition that like mitigate this to a large extent, where they say that like cultural appropriation is probably a like big thing anyway. Like very few people are like even aware of the full thing. So like how much distortion and appropriation do we really see? And then also like weighing it against just like the millions of people who probably helped by mental health. We think this prioritization of the clashes is A, fair, and B, also something that the teams kind of implicitly agree on by like very much prioritizing this idea of where people are helped and like what things are done. So this is, I think, in the end, the thing that was most important for this decision. So how do opening opposition engage with opening government there? We think that like mainly what they, like, first of all, they mitigate to what degree this will actually make you anxious. They tell us that like these apps do want to keep you in, and if it like doesn't really work, you're more likely to just like explore something else and find like another thing. The important thing is that it kind of turns you on to this. And that like these like, that these achievements and reminders are actually what make you do it and make you like access all of these benefits. And then against the idea of like bringing out problem awareness that didn't exist beforehand, they tell us that, well, if like the use is probably not as damaging as just keeping your emotions in and like otherwise just exploding. We think this is like of similar analysis. So we're like not sure which is like more likely necessarily, whether you like become aware of problems that didn't exist or like keep in emotions and don't deal with problems that exist. So like that kind of washes it out. We think the like most important thing then that opening opposition proved to us that like helps them win this class is that they like do a lot of analysis on why you're able to increase access and why this specifically happens through commercialization. They explain this by telling us that you need kind of things like ads and commerce to get wide distribution, that this like now enters other media and other spaces, and like therefore just brings out the reach. They say that like there'll be like more popularity of this and just recommendations where this also pops up in your friend group, etc. And then they also say that uniquely these like short tidbits of things, and especially the things that opening government also talks about with apps, etc., just like need a lot less time and are also available to you immediately when you need them, trading that off against the kind of alternatives that opening government gives by saying that like rather than having to find a therapist or a support group, you can have this now when you have an anxiety attack or when you're lying in bed and like kind of want help in this moment, which I think like A, serves to mitigate how much worse this necessarily is than the alternatives. And then B, we think we have like more of an explanation here of why the access vastly expands. Then we are necessarily certain how the crowd out point of opening government, say, works, where we're like not necessarily sure why you'd otherwise access all of these like alternatives and therapy and group therapy, etc. What we do think, so like, yeah, we think we're A, like not as certain about that, B, like opening opposition do enough to mitigate that these things are not necessarily better and that these apps have some unique benefits that you can only access through them. And then we think like the most important thing that they prove is that like you also just vastly expand awareness and people reaching that and dealing with these problems at all who otherwise maybe wouldn't do that and would just like suffer from their mental health. We think this then in the end like takes the opening half and means that opening opposition like win over opening government. I'll now bring like in the closing teams one by one, discuss what they add to the debate and how that trades off to each of the teams that we had in the discussion before. So first, like closing government. So we think like the main new contributions that we like get out of closing government is like the characterization of a new alternative and a new thing that might happen instead. So rather than the opening talking about like traditional, more maybe Western things like therapy and help groups, closing government talk about like monks and traditional retreats and like characterize these actors and say like they like would teach you for free and they would often like just want to spread this humanitarian aid. Like I think they do a lot to show to us that like these would probably be very good alternatives. We think like the problem lies more again with like why you're necessarily able to access these alternatives in the other world. The like analysis that we like get on this is mainly that like you might be turned off from just all of this by like having had a bad experience with these apps and now don't access mindfulness at all. Note that this like still doesn't answer the question of why like without these mindfulness apps you would have now sought out these monks. And then they also say that like, well, this is comparatively like harder to do it on these apps, but again, we think this like doesn't fully like convince us of like why you would have accessed the alternative, like even if these apps now turn you off. Like even if we think that this like works for like a couple people and they've probably added some plausibility here of like why some people don't access this, we think that like compared to the opening, the alternative is like maybe probably just as good for people than the alternatives in opening. Some of us also think that plausibly openings alternatives are like more likely to occur than like now going for these monks. I don't necessarily think we need to like even weigh that off. But I think like that this alternative by itself like doesn't add so much here when we don't see how people are more likely to access it. So the more valuable part is kind of the idea of being turned off this and not really going for it. We think this is like, again, not something that we're like entirely certain of that this happens. And then what like, what like this also relies on very heavily and why this then takes under opening government is opening governance analysis of why these apps are not necessarily good for you and why they're not necessarily helping you and how they cause anxiety. We think this proof of like why this is bad like does way more for the case of the government bench than closings additions on like another alternative that you might now not access. We think that also compared to opening opposition, like you're still like not really able to overcome just the idea that this is vastly more accessible. And we think that on this opening opposition like still have brought a lot of mechanisms that are not really taken out by closing government, either on why like a lot of people would now have that access and deal with these problems. Comparatively, we don't see that like even if we buy that closing government's alternative has a better quality, we don't see how you come like anywhere close to the quantity of this. And yeah. And then bringing in closing opposition, quickly some water, it's hot here. Yeah, so closing opposition is probably like the team that we have the longest discussion on, or at least like the long diagonal. So I'm gonna like bring first in isolation kind of the case and the like unique contributions that we have from closing opposition. And this is probably also something where we like needed to discuss a lot. We think like closing opposition brings in as its new case, basically the idea of normalization, and a lot more people being like able to access this. And they like also expand this a bit by giving us more impact characterization on like men in particular, or like maybe rugby dudes, I think is the wording. Maybe I'm getting the slang wrong. Anyway, and like mothers now accessing this, which like adds a bit to the impact characterization. Now, like the mechanism of normalization, we think is like relies kind of on, in this debate, on two mechanisms that lead us there. The first one, we think we already get an opening opposition, and that is just getting people to talk about this and getting like your family to talk about this and like people around you and your friends. We think this already like does a lot to show that this probably happens. We think the like unique contributions on like over this mechanism to the impact that closing opposition give to us are like not very much that we could find as a panel. The like unique mechanistic contribution or the analytical contribution to why this impact occurs is mainly on like saying that in a capitalist world, attaching monetary value to this leads to leads more to like normalization and to us seeing this as important and to us in general thinking this happens. Now, like looking at this, like then as its own like contribution and case in the debate, we are like not certain how much more plausibility this analysis necessarily adds to the idea of like normalization and just proliferating the idea of like mental health impacts. We think closing opposition have like some additions here in like how this is likely to happen by also talking about new mechanisms, and also some on like the impact characterization on why we should care by talking about more groups. But we don't think that they like essentially really take that point of proliferation or access, meaning that their opening still takes it over them. Then comparing that to like opening government, we think that we then like have to make a trade-off between the unique contributions to that impact from closing opposition against the idea of opening government, that these things actually stress you out and are like really bad, as opposed to like some other things that you might do, or even like potentially nothing that you might do. And then additionally, also the second point that opening government bring to us on like cultural identity and like legitimacy and just distorting that history and these things. We think like the second point, we don't have any response and engagement with from closing government, which means it like still stands for the comparison, even if like the other clash is more important. And then, but we do think that like it becomes a bit more important because the other clash is like not clearly resolved to us. Also at the point at which closing government don't have many unique new responses to the ideas of like this giving you anxiety and stressing you out and being a bad method that comes out of opening government. So in the comparison to them, this point like still stands more than in the comparison to opening opposition. And then like weighing this against kind of the like proliferation of these things makes it not sure to us where like the outcomes on people's mental health are necessarily better, at which point we then do think that like the metrics of like the cultural appropriation that OG bring like still then becomes important as a tiebreaker. And we also think that like the lack of like unique and new engagement with opening government, given that closing opposition had like way more of a chance to do this and to do the trade-off, then become important for us to like narrowly decide it in favor of opening government. Yeah, like last thing, closing half comparison. We think that's still like comparing just like we think both teams have like engagement to each other. We think that like closing government do like a good attack on the kind of mechanism of how much the value necessarily means that you're like now thinking this is more important. We think this like works as mitigation, that you don't necessarily just because you paid for it think this thing matters. But we think like equally also closing opposition point out that you don't just want religions and you don't just want religious help, you also want like maybe these alternatives and these commercial things and kind of weigh that against their stakeholders and the idea of like accessing men and mothers and people who otherwise wouldn't have. We think that like then by the end of it still what closing opposition have brought to this debate in terms of further characterizing that impact and like furthering that point on reaching more people with the normalization outweighs the contributions that closing opposition have made on like adding some on like the alternatives that you might access when we're not certain how you get there. I hope this is sufficiently clear. If you have further questions, feel very free to approach me either on Facebook, Discord, or also, as I said, talk to my wings. They were excellent and certainly also have valuable insights for you. And like enjoy your evening and the best of luck for tomorrow.
Thanks a lot for the feedback.